Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the UWM Alumni Association January Master Chat. I'm Michelle Putz, the president of the Alumni Board, and in this monthly series, we will feature university leaders and alumni experts who share current developments on campus. Like college students throughout the country, UWM faces a pyramid of mental, physical, and academical challenges, particularly since March of 2020. UWM has approached the needs of student, faculty, and staff post-pandemic through trauma-informed care, or TIC, an approach that calls for university-wide awareness of trauma and its effects. This approach today is being led by Adam Jussel, UWM's Dean of Students, and Dr. Dimitri Topitzes, co-founder and director of clinical services at the Institute for Child and Family Wellbeing, and professor and chair of the Helen School of Social Welfare. During this chat, Adam and Dimitris will explain why TIC, or trauma-informed care, is necessary for post-COVID-19 higher education, how they have introduced it to the broader campus community, and the impact it has had since fall of 2021. Thank you again for being with us today, either on campus or via live stream, to learn more about this important topic. We will reserve time at the end of this session for any audience questions. So thank you very much, and please help me welcome Adam and Demetrius to the studio.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adam Jussel, and I'm the Dean of Students here alongside my good friend and colleague, Dimitri Topitzes. Excited to be here today in the fourth floor of this beautiful library and overlooking the city, even though it's a little foggy out for those that are on camera. First thing we're going to do is just a short breathing exercise. I teach breathing practices to students, and now with this work to faculty and staff, it is a really great way to bring us all into the same space together. If you're like me, you ran from one meeting to another, and so this is a great way to center us. The practice I like to teach is called triangle breathing, just because of its simplicity. And triangle breathing, I'll explain it, I'll show it, and then I'll run us through a couple rounds. It's just a 4-count inhale, a 4-count hold, and a 4-count exhale. Really simple, right? It's like a triangle. So I'll show one round, and then I'll lead us through a couple. So it's a 4-count inhale, a 4-count hold, and then a 4-count exhale. Like I said, really simple. So you can go ahead and breathe normally. You can keep your eyes open or closed as you're comfortable. Go ahead and inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. Thank you for participating. I'm going to turn it over to Dimitri, and we'll go from there.
All right, thank you, Adam. Can you all hear me? Is this coming in loud and clear? Okay, excellent. So we're going to start by defining the term trauma with generally the premise that the past, we're coming upon 3 years now, has certainly been different for many people. It's been stressful for many people. And even for some people, it's been traumatically stressful. So we want to understand, what does this word trauma or traumatic stress mean? And from there, we're going to build our collaborative, collective approach to addressing trauma on campus in a way that can hopefully help engage students, faculty, and staff alike. So when we use the term trauma, what do we mean? Well, typically we mean two different things. Number one, a traumatic experience is one that includes an event itself, some kind of exposure event, and then in the aftermath of that event, there's some kind of negative consequences that emerge. Sometimes we call that post-traumatic stress, but it can be a number of various kind of consequences that emerge in the aftermath of trauma exposure. So we want to understand both what do we mean by a traumatic event or an exposure experience, and what do we mean by the consequences that potentially can arise in the aftermath of that experience. Okay, so let's start with the exposure. According to the official mental health definition of the term, a traumatic exposure is defined as any one of three different types of events. It's actual or threat of death, serious physical injury, or sexual violence. Let me say that again. It's actual or threat of death, serious physical injury, or sexual violence. And I can encounter that type of event in any one of four different modalities. That can take place either directly, I'm a victim, say, of a violent crime. It can take place by me witnessing something like that happening in my environment. I see someone else become a victim of a violent crime. It can happen by virtue of me hearing about a loved one being exposed to one of these types of events. God forbid I hear that my wife was a victim of a violent crime when I go home tonight, and then it's as if it happened to me because I care about her so much, I love her so much, then I am at risk for post-traumatic stress disorder or some kind of consequences of trauma exposure. Or it can happen in a fourth modality by virtue of me hearing about someone who's experienced something like this, and I'm hearing about them in a helping context. I'm working with them, say, as a professional counselor, social worker, student service provider, etc. Okay, so three different types of events, four different modalities. What is the problem with this definition of a potential traumatic event? Why is this too limiting? Many of us in the trauma studies world would argue this is too constricting of a definition. Why? There are several different reasons. Let me ask that question, and this is not rhetorical in nature. Anyone in the audience, please feel free to answer. Yes, sir.
Well, what I can see is these are things that have happened, but you don't talk about things that might happen.
Or things that continue to happen that are sort of ongoing. So excellent. These are acute events. But what about chronic conditions that are sort of ongoing in time? Say like exposure to extreme poverty, exposure to ongoing racism stress, exposure to social isolation and health risk that the pandemic introduced. So what about conditions that are potentially traumatic in nature? These are events, but what about conditions and situations? Those aren't necessarily accounted for in this definition, and we want to think about perhaps more chronic conditions, and that's not in here. Excellent. What else? What else might be limiting? Yes, ma'am. That's right. So there are these events that are taking place that they don't happen directly to me. I don't witness them necessarily, but I know they're in the ether, right? And I know and so it could lead to some kind of hypervigilance on my part, even some kind of restricting of functioning, simply because I know there's danger out there. Again, that kind of falls under this ongoing condition. Excuse me. Exactly. Yes, sir. Say that again. I didn't hear you. TikTok. Oh, you become addicted to it. Okay. Exactly right. Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, for instance, think about what happened during 9/11. We were all witnessing this event, even not necessarily directly in our environment, but watching it on TV. And what did we find after 9/11? Rates of PTSD skyrocketed, and not just in New York City, throughout the country because we're sort of witnessing it in our environment, even though it's not in our immediate environment. Exactly right. So there are a few other limitations of this definition. One, it doesn't really acknowledge ongoing chronic experiences. Two, it doesn't really recognize, look at this definition, physical injury, sexual violence, death. These are physical events. These are events that sort of would affect me at the physical plane. But what about events that would affect me just sort of at the level of emotional functioning? What about, say, emotional abuse or relating to someone else? I'm in a relationship that is, maybe it's not physically abusive, but it's emotionally coercive. So we want to take into account emotional experiences that might be traumatic in nature, but might not be physically traumatic. And then a third sort of limitation of this definition is that it doesn't necessarily honor individual variation or subjectivity. So what you all might experience as being a problematic event, say the pandemic was maybe an irritation for some, maybe it was really stressful for some at times, but for me it was a traumatic experience. It was traumatically stressful. There's individual variation, subjectivity, that we want to acknowledge or take into account when we try to understand this definition of trauma and the experience that people have when it comes to traumatic events or experiences. Okay. So given those limitations, this tends to be a definition, a more inclusive definition that many people in the trauma studies world prefer as opposed to that previous one. And this definition, advanced by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, argues that trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances. An event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances. So in this definition, what took place during the pandemic could potentially constitute an ongoing experience of traumatic stress. So, for instance, well, I'm worried about my health, or I'm worried about the health of loved ones. This is, someone mentioned this, something that could happen, for instance. I'm experiencing a good deal of social isolation. Maybe I've even experienced the death of a loved one or a close associate, et cetera. And maybe I'm experiencing economic insecurity, sort of at an emotional level. So this potentially could be an ongoing experience of traumatic stress, according to this definition, whereas in that previous definition, it would not necessarily constitute traumatic stress. Okay, so an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual as. And again, what that means is what I might experience as really problematic and traumatically stressful, you all might experience as being, well, it's an irritant, or maybe it's stressful, but it's not a trauma. As what? As physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. So my experience of the pandemic felt like it was life-threatening. Felt like the rug could have been pulled from under me at any point, whether that was physically, emotionally, economically, socially, etc. Whereas your experience of the pandemic might have been, again, it was an irritant. Maybe there were some benefits to it. Maybe there were some disadvantages to it. But it wasn't life-threatening. It didn't feel like it was really ominous, significant, etc. And it's going to have, the last part of the definition, it's going to have lasting adverse effects on any number of or any combination of different domains of functioning. You can see what those there are there. Mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual. And again, our assertion in this presentation today and in the work that we've been doing over the course of the last 2+ years is that the pandemic was experienced by many people on campus as not just an irritant, not just as stressful, but as potentially traumatically stressful. And this definition can help us understand why. Pass it back to my friend Adam.
All right, so we set out to determine what has initially been the experience of our students, both prior to and during the pandemic. So this is the data-heavy portion of our presentation, so bear with us as we talk through research. So first we wanted to know what is, in general, the prevalence of trauma amongst college-age students, and college students specifically. And what we found is that rates of exposure, at least to one traumatic event, hover in the 50 to 85%. This is research that's been done over time. And that is significant. At the high end, at least 85% of college students having experienced at least one traumatic event. And then around 9% would classify as having or screening positive for post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a couple reasons for that. One, college students, as we know, developmentally, especially traditionally aged college students, it's a challenging developmental time. You've come out of high school, you're away from your family, you may be living in a residence hall. There's all these factors. You're trying to choose a major, your identity, that type of thing. So it allows for these additional stressors, which we'll talk about, which, as Dimitri noted, stressors over time can be considered traumatic. The second thing, and this is true of college students everywhere, and UWM is no exception, but increased access to alcohol and drugs, is a risk factor associated with exposure to trauma amongst college students. So again, a unique developmental time for students, for college students, that may indicate high rates of trauma exposure. Now we're gonna talk about UWM students specifically for a minute. And Dimitri noted experience of poverty can be considered traumatic, especially if it occurs over time. This is data from a research study that we did through the Hope Center, which is an institute at Temple University that researches specifically basic needs and security amongst college students nationwide. And UWM was fortunate to be a participant in this research survey. We sent this out to all students in 2021, the survey. We got about 5,000 responses from all 3 campuses, undergraduate and graduate students, so all students. And 5,000, just for those that maybe haven't done research, that's a fairly large N. That's a large response rate here. So we were really grateful for that. And I'm not going to read all the data here, but a couple things. On your left-hand side of the screen, about half of our students experienced at least one basic needs insecurity during the past year, the year prior that they took the survey. Now, basic needs insecurity is food insecurity, housing insecurity, and homelessness. Those are the 3 kind of major vectors that we're looking at. Food insecurity, we ask a series of questions, and it's essentially trying to get at, have you had access to sufficiently nutritious food through socially acceptable means? So this is it's a rubric that is developed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to test that out. And what we found is that a significant number of our students had experienced that definition of food insecurity during the past year. So this is the 2020 to 2021 year. Housing insecurity is different than homelessness. So housing insecurity is, I have a regular place of abode, but it's not my own. So when I provide this training to students, couch surfing is often the term that they use, is that I've got a place to go, I've got a place to sleep, but it's not my own. I don't have a regular place. And you can think about the stressors associated with that. I don't know where my next bed is gonna be. I don't know if it's gonna be this person's couch or that person's couch. So hard to engage in an educational environment when you have that level of kind of insecurity. And then homelessness, we do have homeless students here at UWM. That is, I don't have a regular place of abode at all. On the left-hand side of the screen is comparison data. So that's data comparing UWM to other institutions that took the survey. Now, these aren't peer institutions, so they're not apple-to-apples comparison. But what it does show is that compared to the other institutions that took the survey at the same time, we're a little bit higher than those other institutions across most of those vectors. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, there's 2 things that I want to point out. One is students that present with basic needs insecurity, and this is true for everybody who has basic needs insecurity, they have often compounding and overlapping needs. Well, what do I mean by that? That means if a student comes into our office and says, hey, I need access to the food pantry, we're training our team to say what else is going on, because there's often other needs that need to be addressed rather than just putting a Band-Aid on the specific need in that moment. Well, not rather than, in addition to. So this data bore that out, which is there's often mental health challenges associated with basic needs insecurity or other areas of need of advocacy. And then finally, our students from marginalized and minoritized backgrounds experienced greater basic needs insecurity than our majority student population, and that data is on your bottom right-hand corner of the screen. All right. So talk about academic stress for a minute. Again, another data-heavy slide. Suffice to say, our students are experiencing, and this is true nationally, greater academic stress as the pandemic continues. There was some thought that as the pandemic entered kind of the second year and now into the third year, that stress would level off, that students would kind of get used to that experience. And that has not happened. It's continuing to elevate as they do surveys year over year. So that means more students, more stressed as they enter the classroom space. And we've seen this kind of manifest in a couple different ways, and I'll point that out. This is not on the slides, but students either withdrawing from the class earlier in a semester than they normally would. We're seeing that a lot from our faculty and academic advisors saying, hey, more and more students are either lowering their course load below full time or disengaging from the class earlier in the semester, that indicates to me that there's some stressors going on there that would otherwise not happen pre-pandemic. We also have students experiencing burnout earlier in the semester. That's the data at the very bottom there. Surveys done at The Ohio State University. And burnout's a little bit different than just normal stress. Burnout is kind of marked by apathy and disengagement. So sometimes that will appear like, we have a senior, for example, that was super engaged during their first couple years, and now their academic advisor is reporting, hey, they just don't seem like they're into it. They don't seem like they want to be here, or they're just apathetic, not responding to emails. So the kind of summary of this information is stress has increased over time, and anxiety and the associated other behaviors associated with that. Now, this is data that was asking students during the pandemic, what areas of your life has COVID most greatly impacted you or negatively impacted you? And you can see the top 4 there are mental health, motivation or focus, loneliness or isolation, and academics. So when I see that, I think about it's really hard to engage in the classroom if you don't have motivation and focus. Really hard to engage in the classroom if you have loneliness or isolation. What you'll hear from us today is one of the principles of trauma-informed care is that a strong predictor for persevering through trauma is social connection, so having a strong social support network. The pandemic kind of hit us right in the core there from a trauma-informed lens because it pushed us farther away from each other. So we had more students experiencing more isolation, more loneliness, which impacted their mental health, impacted their classroom performance. Now we're going to touch briefly on the staff and faculty experience as well.
So not only are our students experiencing a great deal of adversity and stress during this time, but also we found through a survey that Adam and I distributed, a good 2 years ago to faculty and staff that actually the experience of the pandemic was stressful and even traumatically stressful for our campus community, our faculty and staff. So we distributed this survey widely, and we had a response rate of about 10% of our entire sort of employment ranks. That's about 600 people, over 600 people responded to this survey. And it included, again, primarily faculty and staff, a small smattering of student employees. And what we found when we embedded within this survey a PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder screening instrument, a well-validated 5-item screening instrument, we found that nearly 40%, about 38% of our faculty and staff screened positive for post-traumatic stress as a result of events or conditions during the pandemic. Let me repeat that. 38% of our faculty and staff screened positive for post-traumatic stress disorder in about we administered this, I think, in around March of 2021. Correct, Adam? Thank you. So March of 2021, nearly 40% screened positive for PTSD. What is the rate of PTSD amongst our combat veterans? Does anybody know? Anyone want to take a guess? Someone take a guess. We've got viewers who are dying to ask, but you're in person. So yes, Ann. 33. Excellent guess. It's actually 18% approximately. So 18% of veterans who returned from combat not just screen positive, actually present with full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. According to the data that we collected, 38% of our faculty and staff and a small percentage of students actually are at risk for not just screening positive for PTSD, but presenting with full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, less than 38% would ultimately probably be diagnosed with PTSD, but nonetheless, these are really, really high rates. 72%, or nearly 3 out of 4, endorsed at least one PTSD symptom as a result of the pandemic. Alarmingly high numbers. So we asked ourselves the question, or we asked the data the question, what tended to put our faculty and staff and perhaps some students at risk for positive PTSD screenings? And what we found is that if someone was young in age, they were more likely to screen positive for PTSD. if they were caregiving during this time, whether they were giving care to young children, older adults, what have you, then they were more likely to screen positive for PTSD. We have some really good data both from our own research as well as research across the field that caregiving was exceptionally difficult during the pandemic. I'm not saying anything people here don't know, particularly those of you who had to give care during this time. Those who endorsed experiencing significant social isolation during the pandemic also were more likely to screen positive for PTSD for obvious reasons. I'm just much less able to sort of manage, to muster resilience in the face of adversity if I'm feeling exceptionally socially isolated. We use this kind of unfortunate term during the pandemic, social isolation. Why didn't we use the term physical isolation or physical distancing? The term social isolation connotes that I'm disconnected, whether that's physically or virtually, from someone else. But physical isolation just means I'm physically disconnecting from others, but I'm really maintaining a virtual connection with others. I think those who maintained a virtual connection with other people during the pandemic probably fared better, and at least we have some suggestive research to indicate that that is so. If I experienced a great deal of uncertainty, whether that was economic uncertainty, health uncertainty, maybe social uncertainty, then I also was more likely to screen positive for post-traumatic stress disorder during the pandemic. If I experienced this period, some people called it not just a pandemic, but a syndemic, meaning that there were a lot of different sort of stressors taking place at any one time, not just the public health crisis of COVID-19, but also the political crisis of police violence in our community, perhaps, racism and racism stress or racial injustice in our community, whatever it might be. If people experienced this syndemic as really problematic and the political strife going on as very consequential for them, then they were more likely to screen positive for PTSD. And finally, if they lost a loved one or if a loved one was significantly ill during the pandemic, they were more likely to screen positive for PTSD. But there's some good news in this too. I think I'm continuing on, yeah? There was some good news in this as well. We also asked the data the question, well, what were some protective factors or processes in the midst of the pandemic? What protected me, perhaps, against screening positive for PTSD? What protected me from experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder in the face of the pandemic? Well, number one, spending time outside. And there's actually good research across the field that having some kind of alignment or connection or yoking with the natural world helped to protect me against the effects of the pandemic. Having pets and connecting with those pets during the pandemic also tended to confer some protection. Being with family and friends, again, that doesn't have to be physical. That could have been virtual. If I maintained a connection with my friend group or with my family, for instance, if I conducted Thanksgiving via Zoom, or at least spent some time via Zoom during Thanksgiving in the midst of the pandemic, I was more likely to weather the storm, and I wouldn't screen positive for PTSD. And then if I found my work throughout the course of the pandemic meaningful, whatever that work might have been, I could have been a first responder, I could have been someone who was incredibly necessary during this time, or I could have been a university sort of faculty member who's not incredibly critical during this time. But nonetheless, whatever my work was, if I found it meaningful, that then just helped carry me through this stressful time. And what do we mean by meaningful? Well, Adam and I tried to unpack this with some qualitative data that we had access to. And here's what we think this means. Meaningful meant, number one, that I found my work had a service component to it. I was serving the community or some community by virtue of this work. I was serving students. I was maintaining people's access to groceries or to their mail, whatever it was. I found that my work was service-oriented. Number two, throughout my work, I had the opportunity to maintain social connections or forge social connections with those I served or my colleagues, one of the two. So social connection, even at work, conferred some protection during the pandemic. And then finally, we think that this means that I was able to engage in work that sometimes is referred to as deep work. In other words, I could pour my attention into some project for a somewhat extended period of time or sustained period of time, and that really helped me lose time, sort of lose my sense of stress, lose my sense of identity for a moment, and really engage in work at a very deep level. Has anyone had that experience? I'm sure many, if not all of us, have had that experience. I have this sense of flow because I'm deeply engaged in something. So if someone endorsed the sense of meaningful work, then they were able to avoid any one of these symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. What are the symptoms of PTSD? Let's just review them quickly so that you have a sense of context here. If I endorsed PTSD, what that means is I was experiencing any one of 3 or 4 different sorts of consequences of trauma exposure. What is it? 1, I'd be thinking about this negative experience even when I didn't want to, ruminating about it. It's called re-experiencing. So I'm thinking about my loved one's health risk or my loved one's death or my loved one's illness. I'm thinking about my economic insecurity even when I don't want to. It's just, it's coursing through my thoughts involuntarily. Intrusive thoughts, sometimes that's also called. Number 2, I'm doing everything I can to avoid thinking about this negative experience. And sometimes I'm invoking avoidance mechanisms that might not be in my best interest. Maybe I'm engaging in compulsive behaviors that help me feel sort of at rest, less stressed, but they're not necessarily helping me solve my problems, realize my goals, promote my well-being and health, whatever that might be. So avoidance. And then a final common consequence of trauma exposure that we see in the post-traumatic stress disorder symptom criteria is what we refer to as hypervigilance. And that is that I just can't feel safe at a very even non-conscious level. I can't experience a sense of safety, and so I'm always on alert for threat. And this, again, might be kind of low level, almost ambient and subconscious or non-conscious, but nonetheless, it really affects my functioning. I'm always scanning my environment for the next sort of signal of danger, the next threat. And I'm always ready to respond in a way that doesn't necessarily solve the problem in a deep or extended sort of way, but instead it just preserves my sense of safety. So on alert for threat, hypervigilance, hyperarousal, that's a third. A fourth common response is that I numb out. This is kind of related to avoidance, so it's a little bit redundant, but I tend to feel really disconnected from myself and from other people. So that's PTSD in a nutshell. 40% of our faculty and staff experienced at least 2 or 3 of those symptoms of PTSD. But a number of us did not, a number of faculty and staff did not, and if they didn't, then potentially they invoked some of these protective processes or factors. Okay, so how do we get to this sort of PTSD response? How ultimately can we explain that? Well, let me kind of go back to this hypervigilance definition. When something traumatic happens in my life, as I mentioned earlier, I lose my sense of safety. Like the ground upon which I stand has now been sort of tugged from underneath my feet. And so safety becomes, whereas in the past, when I'm doing fine, safety is almost assumed. It's almost like non-consciously or subconsciously embraced and assumed. But when I've experienced a lot of adversity, adverse conditions, adverse events, all of a sudden safety is no longer assumed, and I feel rather unsafe. And that sense of lack of safety can happen again at a very ambient or subconscious level. And the problem with that, as I mentioned earlier, is that it tends to impair my functioning. So now, whereas in the past I was thinking about how to solve problems, how to engage in my academic studies, how to enjoy my friendships with other people and really get the best out of other people that I interact with, now I'm not engaging in these kind of higher order thought processes. That requires kind of this assumption of safety. When I no longer assume safety, I can't engage in these higher order thought processes. I'm hypervigilant. I'm hyper aroused. I'm always feeling stressed. I'm always in survival mode. I might be feeling a sense of low-level anxiety, and I can't invoke these higher order social problem solving processes, thought or general sort of cognitive problem-solving processes, and I'm engaging in more kind of self-preservation, lower-level brain functions, unfortunately. I can't focus very well. I can't retain information very well. I can't manage my emotions very well. I engage in, or I'm subject to emotion dysregulation, unfortunately. All of these are higher order thought processes. And what we find is that ultimately these can conspire, undermine my functioning, lead to full-blown anxiety, lead to full-blown depression. And we think this is the process that might ultimately be leading to students disengaging from their academic semesters earlier and earlier in the process. I think, Adam, you can attest to this, that we're seeing students ultimately, they're performing less well than they had pre-pandemic. They're disengaging from the academic semester, so not necessarily like near the end, but maybe near the middle or even near the beginning. Because we think what's happening is that there are these very sort of subconscious stress reactions that are unfolding that are ultimately drawing their cognitive load from higher order problem-solving, academic processes, social processes, to these lower order self-preservatory processes, social isolation, et cetera, and they're just not functioning as well as they have in the past. If you have any questions, please sort of catalog them, and we'll be just delighted to come back to them at the end of our time together during our Q&A. So ultimately, what we'd like to do, and what Adam and I are doing with these workshops, and what we're doing with a larger initiative called the Campus Cares Initiative, which Adam will talk about at great length in just a moment, is we're trying to reintroduce a sense of safety and ultimately to promote a sense of growth in the face of this really unique experience that we've all endured over the course of the last 3 years. And what ultimately our hope is, and many of you I'm sure have heard this phrase, our hope is not to return to sort of business as usual. Our hope is ultimately to develop a new normal, something that accounts for, integrates the experience of the last 2.5, 3 years and makes us better for it, but also does so in a way that we feel a greater sense of safety than we have over the course of the 2.5 and 3 years of the pandemic. And what I think a helpful framework for thinking about promoting growth now in the midst of this period is the post-traumatic growth framework, or PTG. And what does this mean? It means that, well, one, it assumes that we all have within us these sort of corrective mechanisms that can ultimately be invoked in the face of stress. Usually, these mechanisms will be invoked if we're not overwhelmed and we have enough social support. But sometimes these mechanisms can't emerge. They're overwhelmed because there's too much stress, too little social support. And for some people, that's the case over the course of the pandemic. So we want to help them re-engage their sort of these corrective mechanisms, these corrective growth mechanisms or resilience mechanisms. And ultimately what that means, reintroduce a sense of safety, and we're doing that through a number of different means, and we'll talk about that, so that ultimately people can re-engage their social support network, maybe even develop a richer social support network, because again, it's not just going back to business as usual, it's ultimately realizing a new normal, something that can promote growth. It's also reprioritizing what's important in life. We were just having a conversation prior to this presentation that many young people are sort of reevaluating their trajectory, maybe their areas of study or how they want to study, ultimately what their vision of themselves will be. That's great. We want to promote that. We want to facilitate that during this time in a way that acknowledges this period but also engages these higher order functions, so it's not just a stressful and reactionary sort of process, but instead it's a growth-filled process. And ultimately, we want people to sort of see themselves in a new way, not just as folks that are sort of surviving this very difficult, stressful time, but instead people that can thrive in a new normal, develop new routines, new identities of themselves, et cetera. So we believe PTG, or post-traumatic growth, is a useful framework to invoke as we're engaged in this work. Whoops.
So now that we know a little bit about what trauma is and kind of the experience amongst our students, faculty, and staff, what is trauma-informed care? That's a phrase that's been bandied about quite a bit throughout the pandemic, so we just want to anchor in a little bit of some basic information about what that is. The 5 principles of trauma-informed care are safety, trustworthiness, social support, collaboration, and individualization. Dimitri has talked at length about safety, but the way we like to phrase this is when you've experienced some sort of trauma, and we would argue that these principles apply even if it's not trauma, if it's just stress, that these are really good kind of grounding principles in creating a caring workplace, a caring classroom. There's nothing particularly needing to separate that out from trauma and stress. This is just good grounding work for caring for other people. The first is being safety, so reestablishing that sense of safety for folks that have experienced trauma is really, really paramount, because as Dimitri mentioned, accessing those higher order functions, if you're constantly scanning for threat, if you're in that fight or flight response, is really, really challenging. And we see this among students kind of anecdotally, is students expressing sense of, and this does not mean that these students all experience trauma, but experiencing fear or threat, or expressing that, but when there is no reasonable threat present. So sometimes students will come to our office and say, well, I felt threatened, and when you ask them that, kind of to relive that experience, if they're willing, a reasonable person wouldn't look at that and say that's threatening, but that sense of safety has been taken away, so sometimes things that wouldn't seem like a threat before are now considered threatening. So what can we do to reestablish that safety? Trustworthiness and transparency. Amongst our faculty and staff, one of the things that we heard was very helpful was communication styles with campus leadership, where campus leadership was just really honest about this, of kind of where the campus was financially, where we were in combating the virus. And so what we heard from folks is that was really valuable to them, to kind of not have to dig through coded language, but to actually hear bluntly, this is where we are. It kind of made folks feel like we're all on the same team. So that transparency is really important. And in the classroom, this is really important too, for faculty to say to students, for example, here are the things that you're going to be held accountable to, and here are the deadlines, and being somewhat open and clear about that initially is really helpful for students, because it gives them a grounding framework where they can get solid footing on. Social supports, you've heard this a couple different times. It was in our faculty and staff data. It's also in our student data, that kind of combating that sense of loneliness, creating opportunities for collaboration, and connection with others. Empowerment and choice. So one way this shows up in our office, for example, is when a student comes to my office and maybe they're complaining about a faculty member, maybe they're complaining about something campus did, we provide them kind of with the palette of options, but then we empower them to make the choice about what they want to do moving forward. So instead of dictating, okay, here's what's going to happen, that is also anchoring in the safety principle, because then you're giving them control of the situation rather than dictating what is happening. And then recognition of the individual. Dimitri mentioned earlier, this experience, the pandemic, has been incredibly different for everybody. And so we need to recognize that what I may have just experienced as a stressor could be Dimitri's experience of trauma. So it could be wide-ranging, the variety of experiences folks have had. So a couple different things that I want to point out here that we provide to staff and faculty through the workshops I'm going to talk about. Some things to take away here is that you don't need to be a mental health professional to be anchored in trauma-informed care. You need to know where your boundaries are, and you need to know where that moment you need to make a referral out to a professional. But these are principles that anybody can apply in their workplace, in or out of the pandemic, I would argue, as being really, really impactful. And it also does not mean that you can't hold people accountable for their behavior. One of the things that we like to say is that care and accountability aren't mutually exclusive. They are mutually reinforcing. You can be caring for somebody while holding them accountable. A lot of parents parrot that back to me when we provide this presentation. And the number one thing that we hear from faculty, the number one question we hear from faculty is, how do I remain flexible while holding students accountable? Like, if a student says, hey, I need another extension on this deadline, what's the number of extensions I can give? This is actually not a joke. We've gotten this question. What is the number of extensions I can give and no longer be trauma-informed, as if there's no black and white number there. But what we tell faculty is that you can provide a set structure and flexibility and care for students while upholding the rigor of the classroom. Those aren't mutually exclusive. So, actually, I'm going to skip that one and I'll come back. Because we're talking about this, we developed with colleagues a trauma-informed toolkit for faculty. So if a faculty member was surfing our website and said, I want to apply these principles in my classroom, I'm not sure how to do it, where do I start? Well, we've got a ready start guide essentially for them. We also do these workshops. We go into the classroom, we partner with the Center for Education, Teaching and Learning on campus, CETL, and we go into the classroom and we'll actually work with faculty one-on-one on developing a syllabus that's more trauma-informed, developing assignments that are more trauma-informed. And again, trauma-informed is just the language that we use, but it's really just how do you create an environment in your classroom that is more caring, empathetic, allows students to thrive and flourish, right? So that's just the language that we use. Here are some examples of what trauma-informed instruction is. You know, I already talked about the flexibility and accountability. The other thing we hear really valuable from students is when their faculty encourage and model self-caring behavior. So that can show up in a variety of different ways. Students saying, hey, my faculty emailing me during normal business hours rather than 3 a.m. is really valuable because I know they're practicing self-care and I'm practicing self-care. Or even we have faculty that are doing, that's why we did the mindfulness thing at the beginning, that are doing breath work in the classroom before stressful things, before a big assignment, before a big test, right? And we actually train faculty, if they are interested, on how to do that. And again, we tell faculty, oftentimes faculty, we have really great professors here, just knowing when I've done all I can for a particular student and when I need to refer out to the Dean of Students office, to counseling services, so that I can get them in the hands of the experts there. We also developed a supervisor toolkit. We have a large number of staff and faculty on campus that supervise folks that maybe aren't teaching in the classroom, but are actually supervising folks that do all kinds of student services on campus. So we developed a toolkit and a corresponding training for them as well. Those are some of the principles that are existing in the toolkit itself. Again, the number one thing that is a takeaway here is kind of that collaboration and mutuality, especially as a supervisor, is communicating clearly with staff, kind of that we're all on the same team, I'm willing to put in the work that you're willing to put in. Kind of these are really good principles, again, that existed prior to trauma-informed care. They're just about creating a caring environment. Dimitri and I have done a number of workshops starting in August of the first year of the pandemic. We've done about 120 of them now on campus and off campus. So we have community partners that have reached out to us and said, hey, we're really interested in what you're doing, and kind of interested in not only these workshops, but the framework that we've been trying to employ. The one thing I'll say here as a caveat is we're still figuring it out. So I say this all the time, is that when I hear from folks, hey, where is this caring environment that you've all been talking about? It's very much a work in progress, right? We're trying to make this happen, and in part trying to do it in a very stressful time for everybody, including the people that are doing this work. So very briefly going to touch on the Campus Cares Initiative. So this is work that Dimitri, I, and several other colleagues on campus have really found kind of meaningful and impactful. And the central thesis is, how do we create a campus environment that's more caring, empathetic, compassionate? And for those that haven't been on campus for a while, there may be moments that you remember in your collegiate career, or maybe when you were working here, that you thought, that we could have done that better as an institution. We could have been more kind and more caring to the people that work here, to our students that go here, and that is really the central thesis of this work: is how do we kind of soften the edges of what is a major institution that sometimes can feel a little bit inhumane and cold. So that's really the central goal of this work. The Campus Cares work, I am told that is a heart and a brain. I keep thinking it's a cloud, but it includes students, faculty, and staff from across campus that are doing this work. Everything from those workshops I mentioned to creating mindfulness spaces on campus. There's actually one in the library right below us, 2 floors in E275. So if you're on your way out and you want to check it out, we created a couple on campus, mindfulness spaces. So doing those workshops, this deep work, and then we're also doing a variety of programming and assessment on campus. What are the best ways we can support students, amplify the good resources we have on campus, including counseling services, our office, and really provide that kind of supportive framework for students, faculty, and staff. I'll tell you, for those that are kind of looking at this and going, this doesn't really feel particularly novel, it just kind of feels basic. This work has actually been highlighted in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is kind of our preeminent publication for our field, at least 3 times, because of its unique nature. So if you're interested in this work beyond this presentation, if you Google Chronicle of Higher Education, UWM, it'll be the first couple articles that'll come up, in part because it's so unique, it's so collaborative, it's so cross-campus. I mean, I'm really grateful for it, but for the pandemic, Dimitri and I wouldn't be out here doing this work that we've really found meaningful and valuable to students, faculty, and staff. So, and it will continue, right? This isn't just a pandemic thing, it's a thing that will continue post-pandemic. And with that, I think we're at the Q&A portion, so I'm not sure how, oh, there's Abby. I was like, who you got? So.
If anyone has questions, just raise your hand and Zach or myself will bring you the microphone.
Hi, I think I have a few questions, but I'll just start with this one. I'm aware that some mental health conditions like depression and anxiety are not curable, but are more managed throughout one's life. And so I'm curious, with PTSD, is that something that, and maybe it depends on the person, but can PTSD, particularly what we're experiencing post-pandemic or due to the pandemic, is that something that can ultimately be healed and go away, or is that a recurring condition throughout one's life?
That's a great question. What is your name?
I'm Gabby from the Roberto Hernandez Center on
Hi,
campus.
Gabby. Yeah, so years ago, PTSD was incredibly intractable. It was a real ominous problem. We didn't really know how to address it, how to treat it, how to resolve it. We only thought potentially of managing it. Unfortunately, combat veterans and rape victims taught us actually how to address it and potentially resolve it. So there's some really good evidence that PTSD can not just be managed, but actually can be resolved. And it's through the introduction of, there are a number of different ways to do so. There are generally 3 basic steps that clinicians will follow to help people who are experiencing full-blown PTSD resolve that experience. The first is through the introduction of both physical and psychological safety. Now, psychological safety requires a lot of intervention, a lot of time, a lot of repetition, a lot of sort of self-knowledge and self-mastery. But once that is achieved, at least to some extent, then oftentimes there's clinicians will help people resolve the experience by virtue of actually revisiting it with them. That's oftentimes referred to as exposure or trauma narrative. And if it's done so within a caring, loving, therapeutic context, and by loving I mean a non-romantic, loving, healthy, professional therapeutic context, then I lose my sense that this is the association that this experience is incredibly harmful, scary, and overwhelming, and that resolves because now I'm not experiencing a harmful, scary, and overwhelming context. I'm instead experiencing a therapeutic context. And so I still have the memory, but I lose the emotional charge. I lose all this fear and grief and shame associated with the experience. And then the third phase is often just kind of revisiting my life so that I'm no longer now a survivor or a victim of trauma. Now I'm someone who has a much larger identity. So can trauma or PTSD be not just managed but resolved? Absolutely. There's really good clinical evidence to suggest that's the case. How do we do that at the collective level? That's the really kind of frontier question right now. The question that is somewhat on the vanguard of a lot of people's, a lot of work these days. And I think we have some ideas as to how to do that. And Adam reviewed a number of processes and activities and inputs that can help us kind of address and potentially even resolve trauma at the collective level, but I think we're still learning that answer. But because we've seen such hopeful templates, examples at the individual level, we're very hopeful for the collective as well. Yeah, great question. And feel free to ask the rest of your questions too. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Steve. I was aware of cumulative traumatic stress syndrome through a nonprofit group I worked with, but so that kind of follows through there. Because there I think they based their science on a study that was done for younger kids when they had cumulative stress. It actually changed their brain development. They did MRI scans and they could see which parts were changed, and that exaggerated the flight and fight characteristics of a part. But I'll let you comment on that. But my question was, have you benchmarked UWM against other universities? I still consider it a commuter college, and maybe that has different elements of students than like a Marquette University or UW-Madison. Have you noticed any benchmarking differences for UWM students?
Yeah. Thanks, Steve, for that question. So as it relates to trauma, we have not specifically. But I will tell you that amongst the other factors that I mentioned throughout, kind of mental health stressors, basic needs insecurity, we do kind of clip at a higher rate of prevalence than other institutions that are peer institutions. So those are institutions that would be more comparable in enrollment, in type of student that enrolls here, et cetera. So we have benchmarked in those spaces, but just not specifically as it relates to trauma. As to your first point about kind of childhood, and I'll let Dimitri jump in too, is that there's a lot of research around adverse childhood events. The ACEs are the acronym, and it does and it can repath and rework. And I'm no brain scientist, but the kind of fight or flight responses in your brain, and the word we like to use is it hijacks that part of your brain so that you no longer can tell threat from safety. So I don't know if you have any other comments on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That it's a great reference. We actually assessed the influence of previous experience of adversity and trauma on the experience of the pandemic. So we did that in our survey study, and we found, indeed, as we would hypothesize, that if I, for instance, had experienced significant adversity and stress prior to the pandemic, I was more likely to experience the pandemic as traumatically stressful. For the very reasons that you just cited, is that this was just another experience of threat, danger, adversity, and stress layered on top of an accumulated experience from my past. And so some people would think, maybe we intuitively think, well, if I've experienced a lot of adversity in the past, then I'm desensitized, I'm conditioned, and I'm equipped to handle additional adversity. But the opposite tends to be true in the data and in my own clinical experience, is that if I've experienced significant adversity and it just tends to accumulate, it erodes my ability to respond well. And the more stress and trauma that tend to pile up, the less my ability to recover, my ability to marshal resilience just weakens. And we found that to be the case with the pandemic. If students, for instance, or faculty and staff had endorsed a good deal of previous trauma, then they were more likely to experience the pandemic as traumatically stressful, and not just, an irritant or stressful, or even in some ways beneficial. So it's a great point.
I have a follow-up question on that. So we're about to enter year 4 of kind of this era of the pandemic. And so we're going to start seeing incoming first-year students who experience the first couple years of high school in online learning and things like that. And so with that said, Dimitri, do we have any sense of how that very traumatic experience of online learning as a freshman or 8th grader or something like that is going to affect students when they get to college? What can we, as we move away from the height of the pandemic in 2020, 2021, what after effects are we going to see of this as a traumatic experience for younger students as they enter college?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to actually punt it to Adam. Suffice it to say, I think the way that we're framing the experience of young people today prior to, say, entrance into college, they've experienced 3 years of the pandemic prior to coming to college. We've thought about it more from a cognitive as opposed to emotional or mental health perspective, at least from the college perspective. But the mental health world is quite clear. Children's mental health has deteriorated a great deal over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. That's been attributed in part to social media, but certainly over the course of the last 3 years, and that's been attributed to the pandemic. So I think we're going to see, again, this kind of cascade or synthesis of negative effects. Cognitive decline by virtue of not engaging as deeply in academic pursuits or academic activities while in high school or middle school during the pandemic, but also that combined with mental health challenges due to the pandemic. So maybe the house is more stressful. There's more economic stress in the house. My parents aren't connecting with their friends and family, so that reduces their well-being. I'm not connecting with my friends. That reduces my well-being. And that all shows up in mental health indicators. We're seeing with young people the rates of depression and anxiety have I don't think it's an exaggeration to use the term skyrocket, or at least significantly increased. It already was high, and we think in part due to social media, the effects of social media, but it's now even jumped higher due to the pandemic. But I'll let Adam speak to sort of the preparedness of students now as they enter into college.
Yeah, I think it's, and we've noticed this already, is losing those developmental years in high school is really impactful on entering college, not only in enrollment, but in persevering and retaining. And it's, not to be glib, but it's something that I worry about significantly, because what we see in K through 12 is what eventually will land on our doorstep. And so we've had this student group where students had some of their high school, but not all of it enter, and they didn't have the waypoints. They weren't able to engage in campus the way students prior to the pandemic were able to. And then you layer on top of that the other factors we've talked about, which is increased mental health stressors, even just the social capital of I don't know how to engage with an academic advisor. I don't know how to engage with my faculty because I missed these 2 years of being able to do that in high school. It's really worrisome. And when you talk to experts, at least experts in that area specifically, they point to a lot of the things that we've pointed to today, but there's no panacea silver bullet for this work. And so it's a lot of people doing really unique things to kind of prepare students, but I see that actually more in the K through 12 space. And even here at UWM and other institutions, kind of the doing orientations specifically for students that have missed those key high school years is really important. So, yeah, it's great.
Other questions from the audience?
There's a thing called transference, and what do you guys do to protect yourself?
Transference. Okay.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question was, in the counseling psychology or the professional counseling world, clinical world, there's a dynamic called transference, which means that if I'm working with a client, then I have to be careful about what kinds of images and emotions and experiences I'm transposing onto that person, so as to not ultimately be treating my own problem. Instead, I'm working with their problem. And the question was, well, what do we do when working with students or when working with the collective in this campus care space to make sure that we're not transposing our experience on the collective and therefore kind of overgeneralizing our experience? It's a great question, and I have a few responses, and I'll hand it back to Adam. Number one, we do research. I've heard people say, the pandemic is traumatic. That's a very dangerous statement in my estimate, or not dangerous, at the very least, that's not a very humble statement. And I think it's an inaccurate statement. We do research to understand whether or not what is the pandemic stressful? Is it positive stress for many people? I can tell you working from home was fantastic for me. Being with my cats, being with my wife, being with my nephew who lives with us, it was a real boon. Now I had to develop some sort of boundaries between work and personal life, but there were some benefits conferred by the pandemic. So I think we have to be really very, very careful about overgeneralizing any one experience to the collective. So we do research to understand, epidemiological research to understand what was the experience like for people. And we're never going to go around saying this was traumatically stressful for everybody. That would be inaccurate and unuseful. So we do research. What else do? We also do not just research that is epidemiological in nature, but is also more experiential in nature, phenomenological. We ask people, what's your experience like? We try to listen to the extent that we can and better understand people's experience. And to Adam's point, and my earlier point, really acknowledge and honor the individual nature of trauma, stress, and just life experience. And then the third thing that I'll say that I do is to keep myself fresh and to make sure that I'm not, again, imposing or transposing my experience on others. Is I do the best I can to do exactly what Adam said, is to model self-care. The word self-care is a little nondescript, but to try to have practices in my life that are regular daily practices that promote my well-being. And keep myself humble and fresh at the kind of physical, emotional, cognitive, and other levels. So those are three, I think, ways that I would respond to that question. I think it's a great question because we have to be really careful about overgeneralizing and transference, et cetera. We have to be really humble as people in this position.
The only other thing that I'll add is we do it in partnership and collaboration with others. Because then that allows for some level of normalization of the experience, but also check on our own experiences. This group that we're talking about, it's 15 to 20 people strong, and it's everybody on campus from deans of colleges to individual faculty to folks that work in our sustainability program and everywhere in between. And that's been really helpful for me and really life-giving for me, because when I walk into that room thinking myself individually, well, this must be everybody's experience, and then hearing, no, in fact it is not, and some people have experienced this as a boon, or some people are liking parts of it and not liking others. It just really grounded, at least us, in kind of that empathetic work. And that's where we get, in fact, the research is great, at least the data that we're able to collect, but the best part of this has been going out and talking to people about their experience and learning what we can do better to manifest change on campus and in the community. So I think one way we do that is kind of combat transference, as you've talked about, is we do it with other people. We do it together, we do it collaboratively.
Edward, I'm having a hard time going from stress to post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Every generation, our generation, grew up with the Vietnam War, very stressful. Is it really different, the times that we're into now?
I was like, we both looked at each other. So I think your question, it's a good one because it comes up a lot, is sometimes we hear, and Dimitri kind of hinted at this, we hear folks throw around trauma, traumatic, when it very well may not be the definition that we use of trauma, which stress can be good, right? The stress in the classroom is good for students, kind of having that deadline is great. Exercise is good stress, right? Like there's good stress out there, but what's the distinction between, I think kind of what you're getting at a little bit is what's the difference between stress and trauma? I think two things. One, I don't know whether it's any different than previous generations. What I do know is that there are different factors at play, including social media, including availability of news, and including the stressors on college students. There is research to show that it is different. That doesn't mean it's better or worse. It just means that it's different. That stress has increased over time. And the second thing I'll note there is that there is a distinction between stress and trauma, and we have to combat ourselves even as presenters from saying everything's traumatic, right? And that's Dimitri just said that, because there is that distinction. And we hear this among students is, well, that experience was traumatic, or I experienced a trauma. And I know, well, I'm never gonna tell a student what their experience was or wasn't, but in the back of my head, especially doing this work, I'm going, well, there is a distinction there, right? So, and Dimitri probably has a better definition there.
It's a great question, and I think it introduces cautionary tales for us. We want to be really careful not to reify the experience or the construct of trauma. And I think that's happened a little bit in our current sort of moment in time. I think while we have acknowledged, rightfully so, the individualistic or subjective nature of the experience of adversity and trauma, and while I think we've done a better job of actually being sensitive to experiences that are adverse and potentially traumatic, that's great. I think the pendulum has also swung where we have labeled experiences that aren't traumatic as traumatic, and it can lead to a little bit of infantilization of people's experiences. So I think we have to be a little careful there, and I think that's kind of the thrust of your question and your concern, and I share it. I share that concern deeply, and I think so. There's a bit of a line to walk here. Let's just briefly define stress and trauma. What is stress? Well, there are three different types of stress. There's Adam just distinguished one, or just identified one. There's eustress, positive stress. Bones don't grow unless they're stressed. Kids don't develop unless they're challenged. I don't often, and this doesn't speak well of me, I don't actually function at my highest unless I feel like some kind of deadline stress. My wife's not pleased with that dynamic, but so be it. It's eustress. It's like there's some good stress that can help us grow. Not only is it good because it's not overwhelming, it's good because I have the resources, internal and external, to be able to address that, to be able to meet that stress, and to master it, and to master the conditions that are associated with that stress. So we want to think about, is it good? Why is it good? It's good because the experience itself isn't overwhelming. It's a deadline. I've seen deadlines before, and I have the resources to deal with it. I've learned how to meet a deadline, and I've got people with me that can support me if I get overwhelmed, whatever. Then there's tolerable stress. And that's the kind of stress where, well, now the actual experience is ratcheted up a little bit. It's a little bit of a unique experience. Sometimes death of a loved one is considered oftentimes tolerable stress. It's unique. It's not normative on a daily basis. But the question becomes, can I manage this unique experience? For some, the death of a loved one might not just be a tolerable stress. It might become more than tolerable stress. But for many, the death of a loved one, particularly if it's what's the term? If it fits within the life course, in other words, it's an older person. I'll use myself as an example. My mom passed away a few years back. She lived a beautiful life. And when she passed, I was grief-stricken. I was mourning. I was sad. But I didn't feel at risk. My safety wasn't threatened. I didn't feel overwhelmed. I had the resources to manage that experience. So it's not normative everyday eustress. It's a little bit of like tolerable stress. But then there's stress that starts to move into the toxic area. So if my mom had died at perhaps a different moment in time, if she had died when I was much younger and didn't have all the skills or all the gifts that she had given me, then perhaps it would become not just tolerable stress, but it could move into the toxic stress area. But if my father was with me and he kind of came and supported me, he kind of ushered me through that, scaffolded me through that experience, it would have been not just eustress, not tolerable stress, maybe it would have been toxic stress, but my dad would have helped me get out of it, and it wouldn't have become full-blown traumatic stress. When it becomes traumatic stress, what happens is that the experience itself is overwhelming and threatens my safety to some extent, whether that's psychological or physical, and I don't have the resources to manage it. Sort of those two things kind of come together at the same time. And the pandemic for some was eustress. For some, it was tolerable stress. For some, it was toxic stress, and then it leached into traumatic stress. And those are, I think, really helpful distinctions. And I think your point is, well, what the heck's the difference between that and what previous generations experienced? And why are we calling it trauma now when we didn't call it trauma back then? And I guess I would say two things. I would say, one, for some people, it probably was traumatic in nature. Vietnam veterans, they actually were the group that taught us about trauma and how to recover from trauma, so we have a great debt of gratitude to them. But no one can tell me that people didn't experience trauma at that time. I think some people did. We just didn't have the framework for understanding it well enough, perhaps, and then helping people overcome it. The second thing I would say is, I agree with you. I think we're overgeneralizing or over-labeling that term. The pendulum has swung. And my hope with greater information and greater collaboration and greater communication and interaction is that we'll come to a center where we're recognizing, well, what truly is traumatic, what isn't traumatic, and ultimately how can we help people overcome the experience of adversity, particularly collective adversity. So it's a great question, it's a great caveat. I share your concern, but I also would perhaps share some qualifications there. That was a long-winded response. I hope that made sense.
Thanks for that presentation. It was really educational and eye-opening. I've been reading books and stuff since the pandemic, like The Body Keeps Score, I think is a really good one. I've been thinking a lot about like social capital for students, for those students who persevered through the online classes and then got through and now is trying to do the post-traumatic growth, mechanisms of being reintroduced to the sense of safety and things like that. How important do you think is building these young people's social capital in terms of like going through college and then being connected with community members or employees to get a job? Because employees have also gone through PTSD. So when we're kind of onboarding these young people into professional roles, like how do you think that's going to be impacted, especially if folks are commuter students or they were a little isolated during the pandemic? How are we encouraging young people to connect with others who may look like them if they're an underrepresented minority, or people who might have connections in the network, and encourage them to also network? Because it could be kind of scary and awkward, especially if they didn't have the opportunities to have those skills.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think encouraging kind of that community building, at least it's kind of on the university side of things, it's an incredibly effective retention tool. Students are more likely to stay engaged and stay here if they meet a faculty member they like, or if they connect really well with people that live in their residence halls. And so we as an institution do the best we as an institution try to connect students to folks that they're within their affinity groups and like you said, look like them, or mentors, on campus. That's really, really impactful. And so we have over 300 student organizations that we try to connect students to. If I have a student in my office, I'm asking them questions about, what are you interested in? What do you want to do beyond just whatever complaint you have, or whatever? Because I'm trying to tease out that if I'm scanning the university and I say, oh, that would be interesting for that person to be connected with, sometimes that little nudge is so impactful for a student, and it also creates this dynamic where they have the skills, hopefully post-graduation, to engage in a workforce that's going to require them to do that at some level. But I'll take your second point there a little bit. What I've heard from especially students that have recently graduated is that some students started their work, their first career completely remote, and have remained that way. And we're in this space here, I don't know if you all notice it, where there's some opportunities to kind of maximize the work from home / work in person, but it's not what we found, at least, is that it's not a catch-all. So completely working from home, there's actually some detriment to that. There's actually some downsides to not, and I kind of early on in the pandemic, I said, well, you can do this work, a lot of this work remotely just as well as you can do in person. And that's actually not true, because you can create these connections at the water cooler, that are really, really important. But there are benefits from having that work from home option. A variety of benefits, but that in mitigating stress, at least at a minimum. So I think I'm interested to see where that goes kind of 1, 2, 3 years down the road when we actually have good research. I just noted yesterday that the Disney CEO said we're going back to 4 days in person. And I thought that was interesting because it's not 5 days. So there's obviously some rationale there as to why not 5. And I don't know where years down the road we will come to, especially with this new generation entering the workforce, what that will look like. But at the minimum, we can say you're going to need to interact with people. You're going to need to have the skills to meet deadlines, to interact with a supervisor and peers. Some of that may occur in person or some of that may occur virtually. But I have heard that from students that have recently graduated is that, hey, this was really hard just doing this completely remotely. I thought it was going to be easy, but it's really challenging. There's also some benefits of we're seeing more and more young people picking places to live that may or may not be accessible to their workplace immediately. So I've had students that have graduated and have moved to a place where the cost of living was significantly lower than Chicago or New York, but are working for companies that are in Chicago and New York. So that'll be even more interesting is their workplace requiring them now to show up back into the big city where the real estate is. So it's a great question, but I think to answer just very bluntly is from a trauma-informed lens, we want to make those connections early and often. It's why we do front-loaded programming for students. It's new student orientation today. It's why we do that work heavily on the front end so that those connections can happen, but continuing to reinforce it over time. Have you talked to your faculty members? Have you talked to the people sitting next to you? And we actually encourage faculty, and part of our workshop is even doing little community building exercises in the classroom can be really impactful for students. Not just group work, but saying, hey, we're going to do, as silly as it sounds, we're going to do some Stoke activities at the beginning of class so that you can connect with people around you that you see every day that you may not know their name, right? So these are little things that can be really impactful.
That's a great question and a great answer, and I would just amplify one point. We want students, I believe, to have an opportunity to connect in a way where they feel comfortable and safe within their social context. Particularly during a time when we're experiencing a lot of stress or coming out of the experience of a lot of stress, we're going to gravitate toward people that we feel familiar with and comfortable with. That's called sorting. We do that. We generally do that as human beings, and we want to honor that. We actually want to promote that amongst our students so that they can engage and feel comfortable. But we don't want to stop there. We also want to promote the opposite. We also want to promote sort of moving outside of this sorting dynamic or tendency and connecting with people who may be less familiar to me. Particularly as I'm developing a kind of professional identity or thinking about myself in the future as a career person or professional graduate, whatever it might be, we've got to be able to, one, feel comfortable in our social network, but also then step outside of that. So we want to provide opportunities for students to sort, connect with people they feel similar to and comfortable with, but we also want to provide opportunities for students to connect with those that they might not naturally sort with. That's good for identity building, that's good for developing academic prowess, and for career building. There's good research to show that how do I develop my career? It's by virtue of connecting with people that aren't at the same stage in my life as me. So I think it's a both-and approach to that problem, particularly as we come out of this stressful period.
We have time for one more question. If there's any more questions in the audience?
A few questions,
Well,
so
it's-
let's hear it.
It's a really basic one. I'm just curious if we'll be able to get a PDF copy of your PowerPoint just because of the data and the information that's in there. I don't know if you were. Okay, that was it.
And end on that question. There's got to
Yes.
be a
Yes
deeper
is the
question
answer.
than that.
Yeah.
That's all good.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Good afternoon now, I guess. My name is Trish. I work with TRIO and pre-college programs here on campus. And we were sitting here, and a couple weeks back, we run, middle schoolers are here on Saturdays with us. We have about 80 of them. And it was a big discussion about a month or so ago. They said, we don't know how to make friends. So I think it completely ties in to what we're hearing, on the ground level. And now we'll have to, I guess, start early with the basics, I guess. So, how do we bridge and bring in those elementary teachers and, and start, I guess, flooding their interest in combating this?
That's so good. It's actually a question that's been on my staff meeting agenda for the entirety of the fall semester. Is this thing that showed up where we said, hey, we have all these great events for students, and students are saying, I don't know how to do the small talk. I don't know how to interact, and that's so fascinating and basic and kind of, but also kind of challenging at the same time, because things that we thought were kind of a no-brainer, so to speak, are now absent from those social skills that students have. And we don't have a great answer to that question. We've even looked at other campuses and said, what are other people doing? And there's part of me wants to go super practical and say we could do some skill building type thing, but I think a lot of time is it's starting early, right? Because by the time students wash up at UWM, if that skill has not been developed, it's even more challenging to ingrain it. We do all these little things where we'll tell our RAs in the residence halls, like, if you're going to something, go tag the 2 students that haven't been to a thing and say, hey, I'm going. So we do those type of things, but there's no silver bullet out there, but that's a great point. It's really excellent, because we've noticed it as well.
All right, thank you all so much. There are paper surveys on your table. Feel free to fill that out. Just leave them on the table for us. We'll collect them. Or you can fill out the post-event survey via the QR code on the piece of paper. So either way helps us immensely to continue planning this programming. Thank you so much to Adam and Dimitri for this great talk, and for all of you for attending. And stay tuned for future events.
Thanks, Abby. Thank you.